Well, I'm delighted to be here today. And one of the things that's most pleasurable is to introduce peer scientists who are very special people. I think you got a little idea about how special they are, but let me describe it to you in more detail. Each one of the people for every prize has a committee, and the committee is maybe between 8 and 10 or 12 people. And the committees all get nominations. Maybe they get 12 nominations, maybe they get 20 nominations. And they pour over all the nominations and truly pick the best of the best. So in 2024, the people that you hear this morning are the best of the best this year, and they're talking about the most timely topics. So that's one of the reasons I really love to come to this session, because you really get to catch up. The first prize today, prize winner today, is the winner of the Lieber Prize. This is a very special prize and a meaningful prize to all of us who do schizophrenia research. The winner of the prize is Deanna Barch, and she will talk to you in just a minute. She comes to us as a professor of psychological and brain scientists at WashU. She has been in this department all of her life, and she became the department chair in 2014. By way of her education, she graduated from Northwestern University with her bachelor's degree. She went to University of Illinois at Urbana for her PhD, and then she did her postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. Soon after that, she returned to WashU, where she has spent her career. What I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an idea of the professional activities of each one of these people and the contributions to science. I still will stay within my 2 minutes, except it's a little hard with Deanna because she does so much. So her professional activities are very broad. She is a member of many, many different groups that generate data for the field. She was a co-investigator for the Human Connectome Project at WashU. She led 2 of the teams at WashU for the Human Connectome Project, and then she developed a broadening of the lifespan. So she developed plans for doing children on the one end and aging on the other end. This Human Connectome Project was done at WashU, but the data they collected wasn't kept at WashU. It was put into the public database, and it was really collected for the field. The same for the ABCD study. She was a site for the ABCD study, and this is a study of normal adolescents. And it's a longitudinal study, so it followed adolescents throughout their adolescence. And whereas they all started out in what would be called a normal control group, as time went on, some of them became succumbed to risk, and that was a study that she uses now to study to look at risk and resilience. This ABCD study is also a public study. And there were a couple, in addition to all of this, there are a couple of cognitive groups in the field that watch over and develop cognition. Centrex is one of them. It used to be that cognition, really, what was recognized as part of schizophrenia was psychosis, but cognition and the cognitive dysfunction was not given much attention. I don't know that it wasn't recognized, but it wasn't given much attention. The Centrex initiatives really focused on that, and she was part of all those too. There hasn't been a significant thing that's happened in cognition and schizophrenia that Deanna hasn't participated in. And she's done so many things. From a psychobiological and a neurobiological perspective, she focuses on the mechanisms that contribute to cognitive impairment and schizophrenia. She was one of the first people and still focuses on it using resting state MRI to identify and access brain networks in psychosis. She's interested in motivational impairment in psychosis and why the motivational impairment is an important thing. Predictors of relapse for psychosis and functional task activation mechanisms are a focus for her. So this morning we're going to have a chance to listen to Deanna talk about identifying risk for developing psychosis so we can promote prevention. Diana?
All right, Carol, thank you for those lovely words. I really want to thank BBRF and everybody here for coming to hear me speak, and thank BBRF for this prize, and dedicate the work to the clients and families of the people with schizophrenia that have participated in all the work I'm going to present, because this work is really about trying to figure out how we can improve life for those individuals. And I'm going to talk today about a piece of my research that really focuses on trying to understand some of the challenges with motivation and maybe pleasure that people with schizophrenia experience, because it is so tied to quality of life and people's ability to function well and to live independently. All right, so just some people may not know, I'll say a little bit about what schizophrenia is. So this can be, though not always, a lifelong and very debilitating illness. It often strikes people just as they're sort of, going into late adolescence, finishing high school, moving out of the home, getting a job, starting college, right? So right sort of at the prime of people's lives. And it can really significantly alter the quality of life and people's ability to live and function independently, particularly when it becomes chronic. It's a really high economic burden for families and society, through the need for treatment, the need for ongoing care and support, and kind of lost productivity and lost quality of life. And what's interesting about schizophrenia, and it's true of pretty much every illness you're going to hear about today, is there are a variety of symptoms that characterize people who have this illness. And I think historically, we've always thought of schizophrenia involving things like hearing voices or seeing things, having delusional beliefs, false beliefs about reality, disorganized behavior or speech that's hard to understand. Also, there's disruptions in some aspects of movement. But we also know now that there are challenges in motivation and pleasure, and challenges in cognition. I'm not going to have time to talk about the work on cognition today, but instead, and insight challenges, that could be a whole other talk. I'm going to focus on challenges in motivation and pleasure, because when we treat people with schizophrenia currently, it typically involves medications, and those medications, when they work, typically do a good job of reducing things like hearing voices, having delusions, some of the disorganized speech and movement disruptions. But what they don't do is help the challenges to motivation or pleasure or cognition, right? So that is an unmet treatment need that currently, often leaves people challenged in their quality of life, even when the medications have treated some of these other symptoms that we kind of classically think of as the key symptoms of schizophrenia. So to answer this question, you really have to ask yourself, well, what normally drives motivation, right? What do we mean by motivation, and what are the components? Well, first and foremost, you have to be motivated because something is enjoyable, pleasurable, rewarding, satisfying to you in some way. And in a very simplified form, I'm going to say that this is supported by certain neurotransmitter systems in the brain, particularly the opioid and GABA systems in the ventral striatum and the orbital frontal cortex. But then, even if you find something rewarding or pleasurable, can you learn what people, actions, behaviors, things predict those rewards if you want to get those rewards again in the future? And that involves a different neurotransmitter system, the dopamine system, in some of the same brain systems, though, striatum, anterior cingulate, and the prefrontal cortex. And then, if you've learned about what can sort of predict future rewards, the question is, can you anticipate those or predict them, right? So that you can kind of use that information to drive your behavior, again, involving the dopamine system. And then importantly, can you create a plan to get that thing, right? And this is particularly important when we're talking about kind of rewards or outcomes that might need behaviors that are extended over time, right? Like I, wanted to write a good talk so I could do well here, and I have to make a plan to like carry out the different steps involved with that, right? And you need to be able to hold on to that, and that importantly involves what we call prefrontal control systems. And then the question is, are you willing to exert the effort to get that outcome, right? Because even if you can make a plan, if it's going to take a lot of effort, you have to be willing to put in that effort. You have to believe that the outcome is sufficiently good to drive that. And if all of those things are functioning, you will engage in motivated behavior to get that rewarding outcome. And the challenge, of course, is that disruptions at any point in this system could lead people to have difficulties gaining, motivated, acting in motivated ways, engaging in motivated behavior. And that might involve schoolwork, occupational work, seeing friends, all kinds of things. And historically, people have really focused on the pleasure part of this for schizophrenia. So in schizophrenia, these symptoms are often referred to as anhedonia, which is defined as a reduction in the ability to experience pleasure, right? And if that were to be true, you could see, well, maybe nothing else is going to function properly, because if you don't enjoy the thing in the first place, you're not going to learn, you're not going to predict, you're not going to develop plans. And I'm going to tell you that that's wrong, right? And that the research my lab and other people have done have shown that that is not what is causing the challenges in motivation among people with schizophrenia, but actually it's more breakdowns kind of later in the system around predicting, planning, exerting effort. That is really where the challenge is for people with schizophrenia. All right, so I'm just going to give you some highlights of a very large body of work from our lab and other labs, just to kind of prove to you that there actually is data showing this. So the first question I'm going to ask is, do people with schizophrenia find outcomes rewarding? And there's many ways you can assess this. You could ask people, do you find this pleasurable? How much are you enjoying it? You can look at eye movements, you can look at brain responses, you can look at physiological responses. So there's a lot of ways that we can do this, and pretty much every way we do this, we see the answer being the same, which is yes, they do find things to be enjoyable. So I'll give you one example. So this was a study we did where we had people go in a scanner so we could measure brain activity while we were having them learn about cues that predict rewards. So they got cues that either predicted they were likely to get a reward, or a cue that said they're likely not to get a reward. And then there was a delay period, and then they got an outcome, right? And so if they saw the yellow cue, most of the time they were going to get money. If they saw the red cue, most of the time they were not going to get money, right? And so we can look at brain responses either to cues or to outcomes, right? And I'm going to show you data from the outcome, because we consider that the sort of, did you find it pleasurable when you got you won money? And the answer is yes. So what I'm showing you here are slices in the brain, like if I sliced down this way and you were looking on the top of my brain. And in particular, I'm showing you activity in a part of the brain called the caudate, which is part of the striatum. The caudate responds when you get a rewarding outcome. And critically, when we look at healthy controls in people with schizophrenia, we see the identical responses in these regions of the brain that respond to rewards when they receive money compared to when they don't receive money. And we've seen this in so many different studies using different modalities. Every way we've tried to answer this question, sort of at a group level at least, people with schizophrenia seem to have intact experiences of pleasure. So then what's the challenge here, right? It's not anhedonia. That is really a misnomer. But maybe it's more about anticipating and planning for the future in terms of rewarding outcomes. And I'll show you again a snippet of data from amongst many studies. So this was a project we did where we both asked people to tell us how they were feeling, and then we measured brain activity to look at their brain's response. And this was a very simple task. We asked people to just guess, is the next thing going to be above 5, or it's going to flip a card, and is the card going to be above 5 or below 5? And then we gave them a prompt to say, how do you think you will feel if you win money, and how do you think you will feel if you lose money? So they're anticipating what they think they'll feel. And then they won or lost money, and we asked them, how do you feel now that you've won or lost money, right? And then we also recorded brain activity while we were doing this. So first, let me show you the responses when they actually win the money, right? Healthy controls, people with schizophrenia. No significant difference, right? Everybody likes winning money. Okay, that's a good thing. But now what about anticipating? So this was quite interesting. So in blue are the healthy controls, and I'm going to point out two things. So first, the healthy controls were very good at predicting how they would feel when they got the outcome. They said they would like it, and they liked it when they got it. But notice what's happening amongst individuals with schizophrenia. When they're anticipating how they will feel, right, they anticipated feeling less pleasure when they win, less pleasure than the healthy controls, and less pleasure than they actually experienced in the moment, right? So they are not either remembering or being able to sort of anticipate and represent how they will actually feel in the moment. They're saying, I'm not going to like it so much, even though they actually really do like it in the moment. And when we measure brain activity, we see a similar well, I'll get to there. We also ask, well, how does this relate to people's behavior in everyday life, right? In my lab, we often have people come into the lab and do things, but we're really interested in what are they experiencing in their everyday life. And we've been able to take advantage of the fact that almost everybody has a smartphone these days, right? So you can use the smartphone to find out more about what people are doing in their everyday lives. How are you feeling? What are you doing? Where are you going? Who do you see? And it turns out that their anticipation of pleasure on that task in the lab predicts whether or not they're going to experience pleasure and interest in their daily life, right? Going about their daily activities. So those people who are able to better anticipate that they'll experience things as pleasurable also have more pleasure and interest in their daily life. There we go. And then when we look at the brain, if we're looking at, again, those cues to say, how much do you think you will anticipate pleasure? We see reductions in brain activity in a variety of brain regions, the anterior cingulate, the caudate, again, in the striatum, the insula, and the putamen. And we do not see differences, again, at the receipt phase, right? So it's really this anticipating, predicting how they might experience pleasure in the future. And then when we look at whether that brain activity predicts pleasure in everyday life, again, using our cell phone apps, we again see that the more the brain responds when you are anticipating pleasure, the more you experience pleasure and interest in your everyday life. We see that in the anterior cingulate, the caudate, the insula. So right away, it's not about in the moment pleasure, but difficulties predicting and anticipating that they might feel something pleasurable. And you can see how that would disrupt your engagement or your planning for future activities. And now we're going to talk about effort, right? Because again, even if you can plan and predict, right, you have to be willing to engage in the effort that it takes in order to be able to get that outcome, right? And again, if you're having difficulty sort of anticipating that pleasure, maybe that's not driving decisions about allocating effort in the way that it needs to for you to be able to engage in that behavior. So the answer here is sort of sometimes people with schizophrenia have challenges exerting effort. How do we measure that? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of effort, right? There's physical effort. Am I willing to walk a long way, do something challenging? But there's also cognitive effort, right? And in our everyday lives, there's a lot of things that you get asked to do that might take a lot of cognitive effort, and maybe they're worth it, maybe they're not. You have to make a decision. So to study that in the lab, we use kind of simplified tasks that we think capture some things about real life. So in this simple task, you just simply pick, do I want to do an easy cognitive task or a harder cognitive task? The harder task in this case was having to actually switch between multiple tasks every trial. And I can vary the amount of money that you get for the hard task. And I can ask, are you more willing to do that hard task if I give you more money to do it, right? If it's more, motivating. And then you do the task and you win money, and we have you go on and do another trial where you may get a different combination of effort and money. This is a little busy, I apologize, but here are outcomes when the hard task is worth 10 cents, 20 cents, and 40 cents, right? Doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up. And this is a study where we had healthy controls, people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar disorder, people with current major depression, we'll come back to that because that's important, and also past major depression. And we looked at to what extent do people increase the amount of effort they're willing to generate when money goes up. And what you can see if you look at this blue line is, not surprisingly, people who are not suffering from a mental illness currently increase the likelihood that they're going to be willing to do that hard task if you give them more money, right? But what we see in schizophrenia in particular, and to some extent in bipolar disorder, and these are people who have had a lifetime history of psychosis with bipolar disorder, is that they do not increase their willingness to exert effort to the same extent when that reward goes up, right? Again, consistent with the fact that if you're having a hard time anticipating that you'll really like getting that reward, it may not drive your willingness to engage in effort as much. And interestingly, we actually don't see a difference there amongst people with major depression, even though they also can have a lot of challenges with motivation and pleasure. All right. What about brain activity when you're thinking about or making decisions about how much effort to allocate? So here we've looked in particular at a brain region called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, sort of front of your brain, and a really important region in planning and problem solving and predicting the future. And so if our hypotheses are right about this is really a challenge of anticipating and planning for pleasure, we should see disruptions in brain activity in this brain region among people with schizophrenia when they're making these choices. And indeed, that is what we see. So here are individuals with schizophrenia, and these are individuals with bipolar disorder with a lifetime history of psychosis compared to healthy controls and people with major depression. And we see a reduction in brain activity when people are making choices between easy and hard tasks that we don't see in the people with major depression. But when we do look at when they're, getting the, the money, and we look in the ventral striatum, right, which is the brain region I told you earlier is more responsive when you're receiving outcomes. And then we look across our diagnostic groups, we see that, again, the people with schizophrenia show a very similar pattern to the healthy controls. They show greater activity when they accept, to do a hard task for a lot of money. But interestingly, we see disruptions in both bipolar disorder and major depression where they're not showing that greater activity to positive outcomes than, not getting money. And I'm going to come back to this because I think we need to be thinking about what might be going on differently in depression than schizophrenia that helps us plan more personalized treatments that would really target whatever disruption is leading to that specific type of motivational impairment. All right. So again, we keep coming back to wanting to tie this to people's everyday life experience because that's what we want to improve, right? Not their performance in the lab. We want things to be better for them in everyday life. And what we see is that willingness to expend effort on these lab-based tasks as the reward goes up relates to all kinds of important things in their daily life, whether they engage in goal-directed activities in their daily life, whether they self-report having challenges with motivation, whether the clinician that they work with rates them as having challenges with motivation, their cognitive function as well. So I'm going to wrap up here, try to keep on time. I think, we've made a lot of breakthroughs in understanding what is and is not going wrong that might lead to challenges with motivated behavior in people with schizophrenia. And we hear from our clients and their families that this is often one of the biggest challenges for people being able to function well. But there are a lot of open questions, right? Is this the same or different across different diagnostic categories? I'm going to tell you now, our hard prediction is that it's different and something different is going on in depression that involves more of an actual reduction in pleasure. We need to understand the developmental course. We actually think for a lot of people this is starting very early in the course of illness, even in like the sort of adolescent years, maybe giving us some opportunity to intervene early. How do we develop better treatments, right? And we're starting to think about maybe we use these sort of batteries of tasks to identify where someone is having a breakdown and develop a treatment that is targeted to their specific challenge. And really a focus on ecological validity. What I mean by that is a focus on what people are actually experiencing in their everyday lives and knowing that whatever we're doing is tapping into that and that our treatments are improving everyday life experience, not just things in the lab. And we've been thinking a lot about how we can help support and improve quality of life, and in fact, how we can maybe use the mobile technology that we've been using to measure experiences in everyday life, actually to support people in their everyday lives and help them, be able to better kind of anticipate and plan for future rewarding outcomes because they are actually really enjoying these things when they happen. And, one pathway to improving life is to help people be able to have more of those experiences that they do find so satisfying and rewarding in their everyday life. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you. What do I do now?
We'll have a question or two for Dr. Yes, Dr. Barge.
Okay.
question right over there.
Okay, yeah.
Do you think that the different components of motivation that you showed in the very beginning and that you've drilled down in people who have the condition of schizophrenia, do you think that those are truly dissociable in all human development? And is there a way, or are there studies that could be done to determine whether variation in each of those components that seem to make sense logically really do have a different or differentiable biological structure to them?
Yeah. So there's good animal work. This is where we are really able to do more of the dissociation, because you can do experimental studies in animals that very clearly dissociate at least some components of that, right? Like you can deplete a mouse of dopamine, right? And it shows every sign of still enjoying, if you give it palatable food, you let it engage in social interactions, it's fine, right? But it won't jump over a wall to go get any of that, right? It like really targets their effort systems. Whereas if you disrupt the opioid system, in a mouse, right, you can see that it, disrupts the pleasure system. It's hard to fully dissociate them because they are dependent on each other though, right? So basically if I ablate, an animal's ability to experience pleasure, you then get disruptions in everything else, as you should, right? Because you kind of need that to drive all those other behaviors, right? So I don't think they're truly dissociable because they are dependent on each other. But I think we can dissociate the sort of fundamental inability to find something rewarding, satisfying, right? I think about social relationships in particular. A lot of people characterize individuals with schizophrenia as like, they're not interested in social relationships. But for the majority of people, that is absolutely not true. They are lonely. They crave interaction. They enjoy it, but they can't seem to do the things that they need to do to get those things. So it's a great question. I would say we can do some of it, but not completely. I saw a gentleman over here. Yeah.
Actually very similar. It had to do with the method. Had to do with the methodology of how, in different cultures, if we use these kinds of methodologies to see reward and control, whether they were true or not. So that was my question, really.
That's a great question. I mean, and I think you would have to adapt it in a culturally appropriate way, because the norms and mores of what people find pleasurable are going to be different across culture. And, I think this is also part of the need for personalized, even within a culture, right? Kind of personalized treatments and approaches, because different people find different things rewarding, right? And part of the trick is finding what's rewarding and motivating for that individual. We done? Thank you.